Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Greetings of peace and blessings, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of the lovingly merciful Lord, Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All praise and thanks is to Him, the guardian, the master of the entire universe. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursaleen ala sayyidina wa habibina wa maulana Muhammad. And we send our peace and our blessings upon all of the great prophets and messengers, and especially upon our beloved Master Muhammad and upon his family and his companions and all those who follow till the end of time. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam and in humanity, my name is Sabrina Mirza, and I serve as the assistant to the beloved Muslim chaplain Imam Sohaib Sultan in the Office of Religious Life at Princeton University. Normally, Imam Sohaib would be the one extending his warmest greetings to you all, but as many of you know, he's been struggling with his diagnosis of stage 4 cancer, and just today he was admitted into the ER with extreme pain and fever, and so he's still in the hospital, and he wanted us to still proceed. But we pray from the depths of our heart that Allah eases his suffering and grants him relief. And can we all recite Surah Al-Fatiha for him? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Rahmanirrahim. Maliki yawmiddin. نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم الضالين. Amen. So let me warmly welcome you all to the Muslim Life Program at Princeton University for our annual Malcolm X Memorial, in which we honor and we celebrate the great human rights martyr Malcolm X. This year, we're honored to host the prominent scholar, community leader, Shaykh Adeyinka Mendes, who's a beloved teacher of mine, for the opening prayer reflection. And after that, we will have a keynote address by author of a dual biography of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, Dr. Peniel Joseph, who is from the University of Texas. And we'll follow that with, we'll close with a prayer. And so I want to encourage you all to stay connected to the Muslim Life Program. I will post in the chat our website. There is a email list that you can subscribe to there. And with that, I want to turn it over to a dear student of ours here at Princeton, Abdel Hamid, who will introduce our first speaker, Adeyinka Mendes.
Thank you, Sabrina. It's my honor to introduce Shaykh Adeyinka Mendes, who is the founder of the Bilal Spiritual Center for Peace, the Arts, and Consciousness, and is the co-founder of the African American Healing, Ancestry, and Development Collective, or the AHAD Collective. He's an educator, author, translator of sacred literature, and spiritual activist who has traveled the world studying Quran exegesis, prophetic narrations, classical Arabic theology, sacred jurisprudence, contemplative arts, and the science of spiritual illumination with living masters. He's been teaching these and other sacred sciences since 2001, and he speaks internationally on Quranic spirituality, youth, and adult rites of passage, peace building, and the healing wisdom of Black Muslim cultures and civilizations. Shaykh Mendes is a recipient of the Center for Global Muslim Life 2020 Spiritual Impact Award, and his latest work, The Spirit of Black Folk, Sages Through the Ages, is due to be released this month. He lives with his wife, Ustada Ruqayyat Yaqub, an author and educator, and their children in New Jersey.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you, and the mercy of God and his blessings. Dear friends, dear elders, brothers and sisters, thank you, Sister Sabrina, for the gracious invitation and introduction. And I'm honored to be before you today to say a few words and to offer an opening prayer before Dr. Peniel Joseph, who, is, I don't know how much everyone appreciates how honored we are to hear from him today. He is one of, I would say, the world's leading scholars, the founder of Black Power Studies, and anyone who's watched his lectures or read his books understands the height and the caliber of his scholarship and the passion, the spirit that drives him. Yesterday, people across the world honored the legacy and the life, the living legacy of Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz Malcolm X. God have mercy upon him. And at Muslim Life at Princeton, we've had this tradition of honoring that legacy, honoring that life, and not just the life of Malcolm, of Brother Malcolm, but honoring the life of his wife, Dr. Betty Bahia Shabazz, who in her own right, was an activist. Of course, she was an educator, honoring the legacy of Malcolm's mother, Louise Little, and his father, Earl Little, who were Garveyites, and who were people who owned land, they owned their own home, and their activism was very much an embodied activism of not just protest, but self-actualization. And so we stand here today to honor everything that built Malcolm, everything that created Malcolm. And Dr. Peniel Joseph's book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm and Martin, calls us to, with his voice, calls us to reconsider and revise this perception that Malcolm and Martin are these two dyads, right, in our history, our American history and our global history, that they are these two, as the Quran mentions, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, bainahuma barzakhun la yabghiyan. Right, between them is an interspace that they don't pass, they don't cross. Dr. Joseph is asking us to challenge that. He brings a voice of unity, of hope, of clarity, I think, and recognizing that this is actually a false dichotomy. If you look at the title, you may assume the sword is Malcolm and the shield is Dr. King. But I think in his remarks, he'll elaborate that they were both swords and they were both shields in their own rights. And a lot of times when we look at African American history, we see, I would say we perceive or we project these false dichotomies onto the personages that we see in the river that Vincent Harding spoke about in his book, his monumental work, There is a River. We see Martin Delany and David Walker on one side, and on the other side is Frederick Douglass, right? We see Dr. W.B. Du Bois on one side, and on the other side is, Booker T. Washington. We see Malcolm on one side and Dr. King on the other. We see Imam Worthuddin Muhammad on one side and Minister Louis Farrakhan on the other. Right? And I think what we're going to be learning about today as we remember Malcolm is that instead of this false dichotomy or these dyads, we're actually looking at two sides of the same coin in the Black radical tradition, which is a tradition that seeks freedom and justice, equality and equity for all human beings, as we would say in the Muslim tradition, for all of the children of Adam. Malcolm X, God have mercy upon him, was a master was a masterful seeker of the truth. People many times chalk this up to his uncanny ability to reinvent himself. But Malcolm fits very nicely in the tradition of Muslim sages that goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years, depending on what kind of Islam you're talking about, right? And when we look at his life and his autobiography, Malcolm was always seeking the truth. And his seeking of the truth required the highest level of integrity for him in his person. And his seeking of the truth demanded that he hold the powers that be to the highest level of integrity. And here again, we see Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, meeting. This voice of moral authority and accountability, not just at a personal level, not just at a micro level, but at a macro level. Before I end my remarks and we say a prayer for Malcolm, prayer for Dr. Betty Shabazz and their family, I want to close by inviting our guests and the attendees to look at Muslim history for its own Malcolms and Martins. And now, I remember when I was a young man, you know, Malcolm represented this, as Dr. Joseph mentions, you know, this Black call to Black radical dignity, self-determination, self-actualization. And Martin represents this call to Black radical citizenship. And when we look at Muslim history, we see the likes of Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who was an Algerian freedom fighter, a mujahid, a warrior, who, like Malcolm, later on becomes this great force for peace in Algeria, in France, and later in Syria, where he and his students saved the lives of thousands of Christians, this Muslim scholar, this Muslim mystic. President Buchanan was so impressed with his valor and his virtue that he actually, you know, sends him gifts. He sends him 2 pistols. And, you know, those were the kind of gifts that heads of state would send each other back in those days. And there's actually a city in the United States, I think it's in Iowa or Idaho, called Cater, right? Named after Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, right? This Muslim hero, who was, again, a great warrior, a great scholar, a great mystic. His books on mysticism are incredible. So we see in him, again, this uniting of a tradition that calls to radical human dignity and self-determination and global citizenship. When we go further through the annals of our history, Muslim history, we see the likes of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, who was a Senegalese scholar and mystic, and who led a successful nonviolent resistance movement in Senegal in the late 19th century, early 20th century, against the brutal French occupation of Senegal. Again, like Dr. King, he chose a methodology of nonviolence that he says he was directed to do so by God himself. Right? But like Malcolm, he was unapologetically, uncompromisingly non-compliant with the machinery of the French imperial empire. If we walk a few more years into closer to the modern age, we find Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was one of the companions of Mohandas Gandhi. He was an Afghani mujahid who fought the British in the beginning, and like Amir Abdul Qadir and like Malcolm, we see him make this transformation from sword to shield, right? After being imprisoned by the British and rediscovering the tradition of nonviolent social change from the life of Prophet Muhammad, God bless him and grant him peace. And so I'm mentioning these names because they're often not mentioned. We hear about Gandhi and we hear about Dr. King, and we hear about Malcolm, and we hear about, Stokely Carmichael, and we hear about Robeson. We're in Princeton, or at least some of us are near Princeton. But a lot of times we don't understand that we have within our own tradition as Muslims personages that embody these archetypes that are not mutually exclusive. And so with that, I want to thank Imam Suhaib. May God heal him. May God give him well-being, who invited me and who made me aware. He recommended Dr. Joseph's work to me, and I thank him for that. And we pray for his health. I want to thank Muslim Life at Princeton. I want to thank the Office for Religious Affairs and all of you for taking the time to come out virtually this evening. And of course, first and foremost, and most importantly, we thank the Creator, the absolute, the one who is attributed with every attribute of perfection, for bringing us all together to learn, to discuss, to have dialogue, maybe even to debate a little this evening in commemoration of the great martyr of America, Malcolm X. And with that, I will just open with a short prayer. It will be an ecumenical prayer as much as possible. I have been asked, and this is a tradition, to recite the opening chapter of the Quran. And those of us that are familiar with the Quran know that the opening chapter is 7 verses. I'll translate them first before we recite them. This opening chapter is called in Arabic Al-Fatiha, which means the opening. It opens the Quran. Muslims use it to begin their prayers, their 5 ritual prayers that they do during the day and the evening. And I'll translate it first, and then we'll recite it. It's traditionally recited for departed souls. And Malcolm and Sister Betty, Mother Betty, have departed from us in body, but their spirits are alive. Their spirits are with us. The meaning of the prayer is in the name of God, the most loving, the eternally compassionate. All praise and all thanks belong to God, the nurturing master of all beings and all worlds, the most loving, the eternally compassionate, the ruler of the day of reward. You alone do we serve, and you alone do we ask for help. Guide us along the straight path, the path of those whom you have blessed, not those upon whom is wrath, nor those who have gone astray. Amen and amen. Creator, we call on you through all of your names. You are one truth, one absolute divine reality, who's called upon by many names, who is related with through many attributes. We thank you for this gathering. We ask that you bless it, that you make it a means for increase in knowledge, in wisdom, in understanding, in mutual respect and appreciation for one another. We ask that it's a means by which we meditate upon the living legacy of your servant, Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz, and that of his family, his blessed wife, Dr. Betty Shabazz, and those who came before him and those who came after him. We ask for well-being and for healing for our beloved brother, Imam Suhaib Sultan. And we ask that you make us conduits of sanctity, of justice, of beauty, of peace, and of radical love in the world. Let us recite Al-Fatiha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. Thank you.
Ameen. Thank you so much for that beautiful prayer, Shaykh Mendes. I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Peniel Joseph. Peniel Joseph holds a joint professorship appointment at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs and the History Department in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas, Austin. He's also the founding director of the LBJ School Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. His career focus has been on Black Power studies, which encompasses interdisciplinary fields such as Africana studies, law and society, women's and ethnic studies, and political science. In addition to being a frequent commentator on issues of race, democracy, and civil rights, Dr. Joseph's most recent book is The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. He also wrote the award-winning books, Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, and Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama. His book, Stokely, A Life, has been called the definitive biography of Stokely Carmichael, the man who has popularized the phrase Black Power. Included among Joseph's other book credits is the editing of the Black Power movement, Rethinking the Civil Rights Black Power Era, and Neighborhood Rebels, Black Power at the Local Level. Dr. Peniel Joseph.
Unmute myself. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. Since I have a hard out at 5 because of childcare, I'm going to be relatively brief in my comments, so maybe we can get a couple of questions on the tail end. This is a hugely important day. Yesterday was the 56th anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X. I think that Malcolm is this figure who his importance just grows over time. I've been, reading and studying Malcolm X for decades now. I'm a native New Yorker, and he's so influenced my life that this recent book, The Sword and the Shield, was really the culmination of a long-term effort to make sense of Malcolm X and the afterlives of Malcolm X, and put him in conversation with Dr. King as well, and really to see how they both influenced each other. So even that the metaphor of the book's title, The Sword and the Shield, we usually think of Malcolm as that political sword and Dr. King as that political shield. And I argue in The Sword and the Shield that we've gotten it wrong in a lot of ways. And I just did something for CNN that I put in the chat too, about just the resurgence of interest in Malcolm, both with not just my book, but the book The Dead Are Arising, the Manning Marable's book, and Manning was a mentor of mine, the Columbia University scholar, the late scholar, A Life of Reinvention. But the Netflix documentary, Who Killed Malcolm X, One Night in Miami. There's so many different iterations that go way beyond, of course, the Spike Lee 1992 Malcolm X film with Denzel Washington, and of course, the autobiography of Malcolm X. And so what I'd like to discuss really briefly is why does Malcolm matter now more than ever, especially in this age of Black Lives Matter? And why does he matter to a number of different communities? Of course, Muslim communities, Christian communities, but also secular communities as well. And when we think about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., I think the reason why we should think about them in tandem is that on some levels, the United States of America embraces one aspect of Dr. King's legacy, but doesn't embrace the radical and revolutionary aspect of that legacy. And the way in which Malcolm is connected to that is that just like King influences Malcolm, Malcolm really is the avatar of post-war global Black radical freedom struggles for human rights. That's what he is. And Malcolm is the person who influences King's radicalism in his revolutionary posture. And I think in that way, the Sword and the Shield really pushes against the grain of just contemporary scholarship, because what people do to Malcolm is put him in a silo. And we make this case that it's only during the last year of his life that he becomes a figure who we should study and we should we should take note of. And I push back against that. I look at Malcolm X as somebody who's in constant evolution, who's always a Muslim. He's always a Muslim. I don't get into sectarianism and saying you can only be a Muslim if you can take the Hajj, because billions of people haven't taken the Hajj in that way. Yet when you think about the expanse of the Islamic world, it is massive, right? So you can't silo people. And so, when we think about Malcolm, I argue that Malcolm, the biggest legacy globally is this legacy of radical Black dignity, which continues in our own time. And what I mean by radical Black dignity is really, it's a panoramic notion that Malcolm defines for us. It's not just Black beauty and Black pride and Black political and cultural self-determination, religious self-determination. That's a part of it. It's not just understanding both a history of racial slavery in the United States, but also a history that precedes racial slavery, history of Africa, the Middle East, that precedes encounters with the West, okay? It's that, but it's not just that. It's not just Black people tapping into not just the trauma of America's searing racial wilderness, but also the joy of being Black, the joy and the pleasures and the successes of being Black. But Black dignity is all those things, and what Malcolm X called for was an end to world white supremacy. So Malcolm understood about colonialism and imperialism and the way in which, when we think about the global North and global South, the way in which the global South had been dominated by white Western imperialism and the politics of white supremacy, right? And so what's extraordinary about Malcolm, when he talks about dignity, he's saying dignity for all of humankind, but we can only get to the universal through the particular struggles of Black people globally. Because Malcolm connects Blackness with the entire so-called third world, and certainly with the Islamic East, right? So when we think about who Malcolm X is, this is an extraordinary figure in that sense. And even when we talk about his political sword, Malcolm talked about self-defense against white supremacy, right? And all people, indigenous people, have the right to self-defense. There's nothing controversial about Malcolm X's call for self-defense, except that he does it in an anti-Black racist society where when Black people call for self-defense and human dignity, it becomes controversial. It becomes reverse racism. It becomes Black supremacy. And the interesting part about the relationship between Malcolm and Martin is that initially, Dr. King and Malcolm get each other wrong because they're coming from such different backgrounds. Malcolm X, born in Omaha, Nebraska, May 19th, 1925. He's the son of Garveyites, Earl and Louise Norton Little. He's the son of folks who are interested in radical Black political self-determination. They're farmers, they own land, they're entrepreneurs. His father is going to be killed in what really turns out to be a street accident if you really look at the book, The Dead Are Arising. But Malcolm always believes white supremacists killed his father. And what's important for us is white supremacists certainly harassed the Little family, both when they were in Nebraska, in Wisconsin, and in Michigan, right? And so Malcolm has a much, much more difficult and traumatic childhood than Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm's mother is placed in a psychiatric facility. And, Malcolm, he admits this in his autobiography, but the new book, The Dead Are Rising, gives us an even granular depiction of this. Malcolm gets into real deep trouble at as early as the age of 12. He's not Detroit red, he's East Lansing red. He's doing all kinds of predatory activities because he's in what the Nation of Islam is going to call the grave of white Western civilization, which is white supremacy. That's why they connect Christianity to slavery, suffering, and death, and Islam to a religion of dignity and freedom and success. So when we think about Malcolm and his, to contrast him with King, it's important for us to understand that Malcolm, not only is he a juvenile delinquent from 12 to 20, he spends almost 7 years in prison between 1945 and 1952, early 1946 when he's really incarcerated. Those almost 77 months in prison really allow Malcolm X to gain access to the lower frequencies of Black life. And so in contrast, Martin Luther King Jr. Is the son of Sweet Auburn Avenue in Atlanta. He's the son of a minister, prominent minister, Ebenezer Baptist Church. In fact, the new first Black senator elected is from the state of Georgia, Reverend Raphael Warnock, is a complete connection to Dr. King, but also to Malcolm, because he's presiding at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And so when we think about Dr. King had experienced racism too, but not the brutality that Malcolm had experienced. Dr. King had experienced segregation too, but not the brutality and the trauma that Malcolm experienced, both as a young man, as a teenager, as a hustler in Roxbury, Boston, in Harlem, but also then in prison. So Dr. King thinks that there can be reform, and he looks at the Nation of Islam and Malcolm as Black supremacists in the late 1950s. He doesn't get it. In contrast, Malcolm's wrong about King. Malcolm thinks of King initially as an Uncle Tom, as a race traitor, as somebody who's a lackey for white power structure. Dr. King is not, but here's the difference. Dr. King believes in radical Black citizenship to Malcolm's radical Black dignity, and citizenship for King is not just the end of racial oppression and the end of racial segregation. Citizenship for King means more than just voting rights. He talks about decent housing. He talks about universal basic income. He talks about citizenship as something where Black folks have health care, have real access to these democratic institutions. But where they differ deeply in the late 50s and early 60s, up until 1963, I argue, is that Dr. King thinks that this system can be reformed for a time, okay? Malcolm is always sure, and Malcolm was right about this, that American democracy was nothing more than American hypocrisy. That's what Malcolm says. He says that anybody who's struggling for democracy in this country is struggling for something they've never had, they don't have now, and never will have. That's what Malcolm said, right? That's very important for us, because when Malcolm uses that metaphor of house Negro versus field Negro, or any of the analogies and metaphors he uses, where he says you can't put a knife in a person's back 9 inches and take it out 6 inches and call it progress. You haven't even, the knife is not pulled out and you haven't even acknowledged the wound. What Malcolm was talking about was the structural violence globally of white supremacy, anti-Black racism, and also racial capitalism, because Malcolm is a critic of that as well. So what's extraordinary about Malcolm and Martin is that they start off as rivals who become adversaries, who over time become each other's alter egos. So what's truly extraordinary is that really by 1963, we're seeing during Malcolm's last year in the Nation of Islam, they're being drawn to each other. You know, Malcolm goes to Washington, D.C. to become temporary head of Muslim Mosque number 4. King is in Alabama, in Birmingham. He's going to be incarcerating, writing letter from Birmingham jail. And you can see the movement, the social movement, the civil rights movements and the Black power movements are radicalizing both of them. It's further radicalizing both of them. For King, you can see some of that radicalization in Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he talks about his disappointment with white moderates and white progressives, and says that they're more interested in an unjust peace than a struggle for justice that is too conflict oriented, right? That makes people uncomfortable. And King really blasts them in Letter from Birmingham Jail, and that's the King we don't talk about. And we'll talk about the radical King in a little bit. Malcolm during that last year comes to see that the political mobilization that King is leading is really important for his own quest for Black dignity. Malcolm is at protests. A lot of people will say that during his time in the Nation of Islam, Malcolm was never at protests. That's factually incorrect. Malcolm was at a lot of different protests. It's just that when the press asked him what he was doing there, he just said, "I'm observing." That's what he would say, right? So it's just with one little rhetorical sleight of hand, he says, "I'm just here to observe." But Malcolm was at the March on Washington. He was at numerous demonstrations throughout the course of his career, and even got the Nation of Islam and different members to participate in those demonstrations, always under the cover of just observation. But Malcolm was trying to radicalize the Nation of Islam to become a much more proactive group, a much more militant group, a much more radical group. And that eventually is going to lead to his ouster from the Nation of Islam. When Malcolm says, after John F. Kennedy is assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, on December 1st in Manhattan, at the speech is God's judgment on white America. After the speech, during Q&A, they ask him about the Kennedy assassination, and he says it's an example of chickens coming home to roost. And what Malcolm meant by that is the same thing that we're seeing in the United States with the racial disparities of the COVID crisis, the white supremacy of MAGA and Trumpism, and the January 6th white supremacist riot at the nation's capital. Those are all examples of chickens coming home to roost. All Malcolm meant by that was that he wasn't excited that Kennedy was assassinated, but that Kennedy and the United States had deployed morally reprehensible and politically indefensible violence against the entire world. So how could they be shocked if that violence boomeranged back onto the sitting president? That's what he meant, right? And we're all facing it now, where we see environmental collapse and disaster. We see global pandemics. We see mass incarceration. We see xenophobia and anti-immigration sentiment, anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Semitism. Just so many different things are examples of chickens coming home to roost. But what's extraordinary for us, and in the time I have left, I want to talk about the convergence. What Malcolm starts to see in 63 and 64, we see it in the ballot or the bullet speech. We see it in Malcolm telling the journalist Robert Penn Warren that him and Dr. King have the same goals, and those goals are human dignity, but they have different tactics. We see it when Malcolm and Martin meet at the United States Senate on March 26, 1964, and that's the only time they met, where they are both in support of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We see it when Malcolm is sitting next to Andrew Young, when Dr. King is speaking at the 369th Armory in Harlem. 8,500 people are there, and Dr. King has just won the Nobel Prize, and Malcolm is sitting right next to Andrew Young, one of King's lieutenants, on December 17th, 1964, and he listens to Dr. King's speech. That's the second speech that he heard Dr. King say, because he had listened to the March on Washington as well from his hotel room. And then finally, of course, in February of 1965, less than 3 weeks before his assassination, Malcolm comes to visit King. He comes to visit King, and he's there to really, he's not able to visit King because King is in jail, but he meets up with Coretta Scott King, his wife, and he tells Coretta Scott King that he admires her husband. He's there to help and not hurt the movement, and show the world that there's going to be an alternative if Black people aren't granted voting rights. So it's important for us to see that Malcolm and Martin are going to converge. And when we think about that last year for Malcolm, Malcolm goes from being Black America's prosecuting attorney to becoming Black America's prime minister. And when we talk about the prosecuting attorney, Malcolm was always prosecuting white America for a series of crimes against Black humanity that dated back to racial slavery. And this is really important because before we had a 1619 project, which is the extraordinary, the Pulitzer Prize winning project from the New York Times, Nicole Hannah-Jones, we had Malcolm X talking about racial slavery and telling Black people that they needed to understand this history, but not be ashamed of that history. He wanted to talk about racial slavery, but also insurrections against white supremacy. He also wanted to talk about class divisions within the Black community, which is why he talked about house Negroes versus field Negroes. So when we think about Malcolm, during that last year, Malcolm is interested in global structural transformation. He takes 2 different tours of Africa and the Middle East from April to May of 1964, and then July to November of 1964. He had first gone to the Middle East in June of 1959. So Malcolm is extensively well-traveled in Africa and the Middle East. And what we see throughout 1964 is that Malcolm is making plans to go to the United Nations, as Black radicals had attempted in the late 1940s and early 50s to charge the United States with human rights violations at the United Nations. Malcolm had access to an office at the United Nations because he had great relationships with African diplomats and leaders. He was able to meet Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. He was able to meet Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria. He was able to meet Mohamed Babu, the Prime Minister of Zanzibar, was one of his closest friends. So when we think about Malcolm, Malcolm is this extraordinary global figure who's criticizing the war in Vietnam, who's talking about the civil rights movement should be a human rights movement, and that radicalism impacts Martin Luther King Jr. It's going to especially impact King after Malcolm's assassination. So when we think about the last 3 years of King's life, that's when we see the radical King, especially after the Watts uprising in Los Angeles, August 11th to August 18th, 1965. And that King is drawing from Malcolm X. That King is saying that Black is beautiful and it's so beautiful to be Black. That King is saying that white lies are little and Black lies are bad. He's looking at the racism of just the English language. That's the King who says that the halls of the United States Congress are running wild with racism. That's the King who, on April 4th, 1967, at the Riverside Church in New York, says that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the entire world. King came out against the Vietnam War 3 years after Malcolm X, right? And that's the King who is saying, really, basically, by 1967-68, that American democracy is nothing but American hypocrisy. So one last anecdote on King, and then I want to end on Malcolm and just open it up. King in 1968 is trying to lead a poor people's campaign, and he uses the same language when he's talking to poor Black folks in Marks, Mississippi. He says that the way they're living is a crime and that they're going to go down to Washington, occupy Washington nonviolently until really justice rolls down like a mighty stream, like the prophet Amos, right? And so when we think about King, King is absolutely echoing the political radicalism and the revolutionary posture of Malcolm X, right? And we usually have it as a one-way street, that Malcolm's humanistic side is drawn from King and King doesn't get anything from Malcolm, right? And so when we think about Malcolm X and why we should not just celebrate him, but really think about the way in which his call for radical Black dignity and human rights impacts our own time, our own global politics right now, it's incredibly, incredibly important. Malcolm provides us with a framework to talk about everything from mass incarceration, voting rights, public policy, democracy, Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, a Muslim international that is dedicated to human rights. When Malcolm writes that he left his heart in Cairo in 1964, talking about the deep ties that he has to both his Muslim faith and the larger Muslim world, he's trying to knit and craft an international global coalition that's going to be multiracial, that's going to be multi-religious, but that is deeply critical of systems of white supremacy, racial capitalism, economic injustice, and anti-Black violence. So Malcolm provides us this huge paradigm, more so than really any figure that we can think of. So he stands alongside of King, no less than King, in being this unbelievably important figure for the age and for the time that we live today. So 56 years later, we're finding a lot more about Malcolm X, the personal side. That's the side who was a a good father, a loving father, a loyal husband, the side who was a faith leader, a community organizer, a grassroots intellectual. He's Gramsci's organic intellectual, self-taught, autodidactic, but brilliant. And somebody who was personally sincere, had deep political integrity and unapologetic love for Black people. So we should celebrate Malcolm X, not only because he understood that Black lives matter, but we celebrate him as an exemplar of the fact that a life filled with purpose can continue to reverberate internationally long past its death. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peniel, for that really illuminating keynote address and book talk. We really encourage everyone to get a copy of his book, The Sword and the Shield. The link is in the chat. It's really great. I really recommend it. And I'll just jump right in because I know time is short. We have one question. Can you talk about the role of forgiveness in Malcolm and Martin's respective conceptions of racial reconciliation?
You know, I think they both thought about forgiveness. I think King initially led with forgiveness. I think Malcolm grew to talk about forgiveness, but forgiveness could only come with racial truth, justice, and healing, right? So by the time he's speaking at Oxford University at the end of 1964, and he says he's willing to have a coalition with anyone, no matter what their skin color is, who wants to change the miserable condition on the face of this earth, the idea of forgiveness was only going to come through one, truth, speaking truth to power, having the trauma that Black people and other indigenous people globally faced acknowledged and recognized. And then justice. Justice was going to be part two, because you were going to have to eradicate thousands of racist policies and unjust structures and institutions and systems and processes, and replace them with ones that brought about justice. And the way in which justice looks like, you know, Cornel West always says, love is what justice looks like, or justice is what love looks like in public. And that's how justice is going to look. We're not going to see, I'm living here in Austin, Texas, and there's so much inequality in Texas. When this storm hit, those who were the most vulnerable are the ones who've died, right? Those are the ones who've died. So these disasters, whether it's COVID-19 or climate change, they hit everyone differently. That's why we think about intersectional justice. They hit the rich differently, the white differently, those who are able-bodied differently, those who have resources differently than those who don't, right? So I think once you got to the justice, you could finally get to the healing and forgiveness. And what I will say about King is that by the end of King's life, King is not leading with forgiveness, which is why white folks hate King by the end of King's life. If you look at all the polling data, and I'll say it again to everybody here, white people hate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the end of his life. They hate him. Why? Because he's talking about white supremacy. And once you start talking about white supremacy, white people hate you, because you're not supposed to talk about what? White supremacy. So he's talking about white supremacy. He's talking about economic injustice, and he's no longer getting the standing ovation. So he's not leading with forgiveness either, because what he wants is a revolution, never talking about violence, but what he wants is a revolution that is moral and political and going to change the status quo, which is why there's such a violent response and reaction against them. Malcolm wants the same revolution, but Malcolm didn't lead with forgiveness. That's why Malcolm told the country, and this is the United States, about itself. So Malcolm's not a believer in American exceptionalism. He understands that American exceptionalism is a lie based on Black dehumanization, but Malcolm's constantly telling folks in debates and anywhere he can about the lie, right? And that's why people hate Malcolm X, right? Because what you're not supposed to do, and Malcolm can out-debate these folks, right? Because Malcolm is brilliant, right? So Malcolm can out-debate and out-argue anyone. And you know, the lie of American exceptionalism is all around us. It's in our prisons, it's in the poverty rate, the COVID-19 rate, it's in the racial segregation in neighborhoods and public schools. It's in our bad health outcomes and maternal birth outcomes in our children with asthma. It's in the racial terror and the the terror against everybody from Muslims to immigrants to folks who are queer and otherwise. So we see the results of the lie all around us, but we live in an era where massive parts of the lie have been exposed through MAGA, through Trumpism, through COVID-19, through the January 6th insurrection. So the whole world is in on the lie. What's extraordinary about Malcolm X is Malcolm X was saying this when the world still believed the United States was this shining city on the hill. He was saying that this is all a lie. And that's extraordinary for us. That's extraordinary. And the courage that it took to say that is extraordinary.
Thank you. A lot of good questions in the chat. Let me see. 50 plus years later, people celebrate both Malcolm and Martin much more than when they were alive. There were other dynamic leaders of that time, like Stokely Carmichael, Rap Brown, Imam Jamil Amin. Why do you think that people, the movement, etc., failed to support these leaders that survived the Black Power era?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think we're talking about structures and systems of violence and white supremacy. You know, there's the new movie Judas and the Black Messiah. There's a movie One Night in Miami, you know, Fred Hampton's murder. I've written a biography of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. I think it's not that. I think grassroots entities supported the Black Panthers. They supported these folks. Angela Davis was put in prison, and through the support of Black people was acquitted and released. And part of the Panther 21 was acquitted and released. So we do have victories, but we had the whole state lined up against us. That's the FBI. That's every single police department and law enforcement agency, the CIA, the State Department. So it became very difficult for movement leaders to survive in that atmosphere. Some people are still political prisoners right now in the United States and globally. So it's hard to fight these systems of power when you're not on an equal playing field. So I think that's what happened. But as we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, the struggle continues. And even pre-BLM, those veterans from the Black Power movement and these international anti-colonial struggles, these revolutionary human rights movements, continued to fight the good fight. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe we can get one more question related to college students. Would you comment on what these leaders like Imam Malcolm saw in the potential of college students to actualize change?
Yeah, they saw great potential. I mean, Malcolm at his core was a teacher. You know, Peter Bailey says that very famously, so does Ossie Davis, but Malcolm was a teacher, but he was, like any good teacher, he was a lifelong student who was intellectually curious, very much inspired by connecting with young people on the streets of Harlem, on the streets of Chicago, on the streets of Africa and the Middle East, wherever young people were, he connected with them. And he found great potential in young people. He had extraordinary hopes that young people were going to lead not just the United States and the West, but the global South from the clutches of the global North and bring about this human rights movement, this movement of racial and economic and just justice for all people. And I think that still holds true. I think the fact that you see so many young people connected to Black Lives Matter, connected to these movements for really deep transformational change. We need deep structural transformational change. And the reason why the issues that Malcolm and Martin were talking about in this movement for radical Black dignity and citizenship continue to haunt all of us today, this is over 50 years later, is that the deep structural transformation and changes that are required have not occurred. So it doesn't mean individuals haven't had the chance to make progress. So you have the first Black president, you have these racial firsts, but what you see is that there's no trickle down effect. Why is that the case? Because the system, the larger trajectory of the world has remained the same, and it's remained on an accelerated pace to continue to marginalize, to demonize, to dehumanize, to murder, to punish, lead to premature death, those both in the global South, literally, geographically, but also those within the US global South, right? Those are all of us who live in the ghettos and the Bantustans of the United States, or whether it's the United States or anywhere else, right? That's the relationship Malcolm was trying to change. And I'll close on this note. Malcolm, when he came back from one of his overseas trips, this is probably the first one in May, he gave a press conference in New York, and they were telling him that there's so many white people who are really excited now that he's talked about progressive whites of Islamic faith could be part of the movement. And he said, well, you know, white people treated me with a lot of dignity overseas, and some of them treat me with a lot of dignity here. But as long as any of my sisters and brothers are not afforded with that same dignity, there's not going to be any peace. There's not going to be any justice, right? So Malcolm understood that it wasn't about an individual's progress or an individual success. As much as we can applaud individual progress and success, it had to come and be a collective vision and a collective victory for the whole entire community. So when we think about dignity and citizenship, we can't just think of that as something that a few of us will enjoy while the rest of us suffer. Malcolm said that the only way we're going to come and achieve that global victory is that every single one of us. And what's great about Malcolm and Martin, you don't have one single story of those two leaders ever turning away people who were poor, who were incarcerated, who were what the Bible calls the least of these, right? Never. There's not one instance. And if people say there is, they're not telling the truth. There's not one instance of those two turning away people who many of us would have a hard time embracing and loving, right? Even pre-COVID, right? Because of what we've been taught. These are folks who led fearlessly and really loved people. They loved Black people. And they loved all people, but they knew the only way we could get to universal justice was through the particular struggles of Black people, because Black people have been the most marginalized, the most demonized, the most dehumanized group on the planet. There is a global racial caste system, but the organizing principle of that caste system is anti-Blackness. We always have to remember that. So it's not just racial justice. The only way we're going to get dignity and citizenship is Black equality and Black dignity and Black citizenship. And you've got to keep saying that even when, especially when it's not popular. And that's why Malcolm is such a hero. He said so many things to us when it wasn't popular. Even when Black people didn't want to hear it, he told us what we needed to hear, not what we wanted to hear. And King gets that lesson from Malcolm, not from anybody else. King gets the lesson that he's got to be a molder of consensus from Malcolm X. And the reason why people don't want you to know that is they don't want you to understand the convergence between both of their thoughts. So that's why they say King is on this side and Malcolm's on this side, right? And you can only choose one, right? But that is a setup. King teaches Malcolm, but Malcolm also teaches King. And I would argue in a lot of ways, that lesson is that revolutionary King that we see. He never mentions and says, thank you, my good brother Malcolm X, for letting me see the light. He saw the light because Malcolm died allowing King to see the light. Malcolm's example is what King sees, right? So it's important for us to understand. If we do that, we have a good chance of confronting the issues that we're facing today with much more intellectual and political and moral religious firepower than without that.
Thank you so much.
And I've got to sign off.
Everyone, we're grateful, we're honored. Thank you so much. Take care. Sorry, guys, I know we didn't get to all of your questions, but thank you all for joining and for being engaged. And I really do encourage everyone to read his book. He's done some really amazing work. I just want to quickly close with a prayer for Malcolm, if you'll join me. Ya Allah, our Lord, most merciful, we thank you and we praise you for the blessing of this gathering to honor our great teacher, leader, human rights martyr, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X. 56 years ago yesterday, Malcolm was martyred while struggling in your way, the way of the righteous, the prophets, the messengers who came before him. May their souls be embraced by your loving mercy and contentment, and may your peace be upon them all, especially upon our beloved messenger, the seal of the prophets Muhammad, who called to the truth and who loved us without even meeting us, who loved us in the deepest sense of the word, whose sweat, blood, and tears poured forth in his steadfast commitment to the well-being of his community and of humanity. Oh Allah, we thank you for leaders like Malcolm, who followed the prophetic way and made incredible sacrifices for us, as did his family. Please accept from them and elevate their ranks. Thank you for giving us such a beautiful model of a Muslim American living a life of sincerity, of principle, and of continuous growth and development. May we embody each of these characteristics truly. Let our faith transform us like it did Malcolm into servants who are beloved to you. O Allah, let Malcolm's legacy live on through us, instill deep within us the courage to carry forward his uncompromising quest for racial justice and for the dignity of Black people. Grant us sincerity in our intentions, clarity in our vision, and urgency in our limbs. Strengthen us to persevere in our struggle against our own selves in your way. O Allah, make us sincere believers like Malcolm, who in the face of extreme provocation and opposition held on to his only constant, which was his faith. Allow us to awaken, to heal, and to meaningfully benefit our society with the light of your message, just as Malcolm understood that Islam is the cure for the spiritual illness of racism and white supremacy in America. O Allah, help us follow the example of Malcolm, who followed the truth wherever the truth took him. And as our beloved messenger Muhammad, peace be upon him, we ask you, O Allah, show us the truth as truth and bless us to follow it, and show us the falsehood as falsehood and bless us to reject it. O Allah, you are al-haq, the truth, the only reality. Let us stand for you so we don't fall for anything else. We ask by our hope in your infinite mercy that you forgive us, guide us, make us sincere, and bestow upon us the honor and the joy of meeting Malcolm in the next life, having lived a life worthy of joining his ranks and greeting him with the greeting of peace. May your peace and blessings be upon him, upon all of our teachers, the prophets, and the messengers, and especially upon the last of the messengers, Muhammad, his family, and his companions. Ameen, ameen, ameen. Thank you all so much for joining, and I want to thank especially our dear teacher, Shaykh Adeyinka Mendes, for your opening prayer reflection. I want to thank Abdul Hamid for introducing our speakers. I want to thank Dr. Peniel Joseph for enlightening us, and of course I want to thank Imam Sohaib, who has organized this effort, who was concerned about this even from the hospital bed, of course. Please continue to pray for him and keep him in your prayers. Have a good night. Thank you so much. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.